The silence from Mars began as a curiosity, a whisper of static on the interstellar comms that technicians dismissed as a coronal mass ejection playing tricks on the relays. For 3 cycles, Earth listened to that growing void, the absence of data, of routine check-ins, of the mundane chatter from the 300,000 souls populating the sprawling Olympus Mons colony. The silence was a loose thread in the tapestry of human expansion, and someone, somewhere, was pulling it. Kalen Vance felt it not as an absence of sound, but as an absence of life. He felt it in the hollow of his chest. A phantom limb ache for a part of humanity he'd never touched, but had always known was there. He lived in a quiet cabin nestled deep in the Cascade Wilderness, a self-imposed exile from a world that screamed too loudly for his frayed nerves to bear. He'd once been a part of the Empath Corps, a psychological warfare division that weaponized hypersensitivities. Men and women like him, born with an overabundance of mirror neurons, were trained to feel the enemy, to immerse themselves in their doctrines and emotions, to predict a fleet's movement by the collective anxiety of its crew. Kalen had been the best, able to taste the metallic tang of a commander's fear from a light year away. But the price was a piece of his own soul, eroded with every mind he touched, until he was nothing more than a mosaic of other people's pain. He'd walked away after the Cygnus campaign, the psychic residue of a dying race clinging to him like grave dust. Now, he chopped wood, tended his garden, and did his best to forget. But the silence from Mars was different. It wasn't the roar of death he remembered from Cygnus. It was a clean, placid, and utterly terrifying null. The long-range drone, the Magellan 4, finally pierced the veil a week later. Its first transmission was not of rubble or wreckage, but of perfection. Olympus Mons stood pristine beneath the thin Martian sky, its biodomes gleaming, its solar arrays tracking the sun with silent, dutiful precision. The drone drifted through the colony's streets, past cafes with tables still set, past playgrounds where toys lay scattered in the red dust, past homes where lights were still on. There were no bodies, no blood, no signs of struggle. There was simply nothing. The 300,000 colonists had vanished, leaving behind only a fine, grayish powder that coated every surface, a substance that spectrometry later identified as denatured organic matter. They hadn't been killed. They had been unwritten. The broadcast of the drone's footage across Earth was a moment of global paralysis. The shared horror was a physical thing, a cold weight that settled in the planet's gut. Then came the message. It appeared not on military channels, but on every public screen, every personal device, overriding all other data. It was a single crystalline spire that grew from a field of stars, impossibly elegant and smooth. As it rotated, a voice spoke. Not in language, but in a series of harmonic tones that translated themselves directly into the brain's linguistic center, a calm, dispassionate melody. "Your dissonance has been muted," it sang. "The chaotic broadcast of your existence, your art, your conflicts, your biology is a discordant note in the grand composition. We are the Ethel. We are the curators of the cosmic garden. And where we find blight, we prune. The Mars colony was such a blight. Cease your broadcast. Do not expand further. The garden must have order." The message ended. The crystalline spire faded, and humanity was left staring into the reflection of its own terrified face on a billion dark screens. The Ethel, a name no one had ever heard. A species that saw genocide not as an act of war, but as an act of aesthetics. They hadn't conquered Mars, they had tidied it. Panic was the first wave, crashing over the planet's governments and markets. Then came the grief, a deep, resonant sorrow for the lost. But beneath it all, a third thing began to stir, an old and familiar feeling that had slumbered in the human heart for a century of relative peace. It was rage, a furious, primal, and deeply personal anger. They hadn't been attacked for their resources, their territory, or their politics. They had been attacked for being human. A black ops transport cut through the clouds above Kalen's cabin 2 days later. The wind from its engines flattened his carefully tended garden, a casual act of destruction that felt like a prelude. A woman emerged, her uniform a stark, starless black, her face a mask of hardened pragmatism. Admiral Eva Rostova didn't waste time with pleasantries. "We're recalling you, Vance," she said, her voice like grinding stone. "Active duty, effective immediately." Kalen didn't look up from the splintered remains of his tomato plants. "I'm retired, I didn't, Admiral. My file says so, base. Psychologically unfit." "Your file says you're the only one who ever got inside the head of a species that didn't think like us," she countered, stepping over the debris. "And these things, they don't think like anyone. Our strategists are useless. They're running simulations for resource grabs and territorial disputes. They can't comprehend an enemy that kills because they don't like our music." She gestured toward the waiting transport. "We can't fight what we don't understand. I need you to get inside their heads. I need you to feel what they feel. I need you to find a way to make them hurt." Kalen finally looked at her, his eyes hollowed out by old wars. "You know what that will do to me." Rostova's expression didn't soften. "I do. I also know that 300,000 people were turned into dust because we couldn't predict this. That will not happen again. The Earth is mobilizing. We're pulling ships out of scrapyards, retrofitting asteroid miners, strapping guns to anything with an engine. But it won't be enough unless we know how to aim." He could feel it coming off her, off the soldiers standing guard, off the very metal of the ship. It was the collective will of a species that had been told its very existence was an ugly mistake. It was a cold, focused fury that was terrifying in its purity. This wasn't a war for planets or power. It was a war for the right to be messy, to be loud, to be flawed. It was a war for the right to be human. Rostova extended a hand. "Help us, Kalen. Help us show them what dissonance really sounds like." He looked at his ruined garden, at the quiet forest that had been his sanctuary, and knew it was already gone. The silence from Mars was spreading, and the only way to fight it was with a scream. As he boarded the transport, the first of the new ships was being christened in the orbital docks above. It had no elegant lines, no gleaming white hull. It was a slab of jagged black armor, bristling with oversized magnetic accelerators and missile pods. Its engines were exposed, brutal things that burned with a barely contained violence. They had named it the Retribution. It wasn't a ship built for exploration or ceremony. It was a fist, clenched and ready to strike. Kalen closed his eyes, the low thrum of the transport vibrating through his bones, and for the first time in years, he opened his mind. He let the simmering rage of 8 billion people flood into him, a tidal wave of grief and fury. He would become their weapon, their antenna, their mirror. He would stare into the cold, perfect heart of the Ethel, and he would show them the terrible, beautiful chaos they so desperately wanted to erase. The garden, he thought with a chilling certainty, was about to be reclaimed by the weeds. The transport descended not onto a sprawling military base, but into a crack in the earth. The location, known only as Bedrock, was a scar carved deep into the Canadian shield, a subterranean fortress that had been a relic of a paranoid, bygone era of internecine conflict. Now, it was the nerve center of humanity's first true interstellar war. The air was cold, recycled, and tasted of ozone and fear. Kalen was led through corridors of raw, unfinished granite, past humming server farms and makeshift barracks where scientists and soldiers shared cramped quarters, their faces illuminated by the pale glow of data screens. There was no ceremony here, no polished brass or proud banners. Bedrock was a place of grim function, a tomb brought back to life to plan a funeral for an entire species. Admiral Rostova led him to a spherical chamber suspended in the heart of a vast cavern by a web of thick cables. It looked like a black iron heart, pulsating with a low, internal energy. "This is the resonance chamber," Rostova said, her voice echoing in the cavernous space. "Project Chimera. It was designed to help soldiers with battlefield trauma reintegrate their fragmented psyches. We've repurposed it." A woman in a lab coat, her face etched with a weary intelligence, met them at the chamber's airlock. "Dr. Eris Thorne," she introduced herself, her handshake firm and dry. "I designed the original therapeutic matrix. What the Admiral is asking of it now is something else entirely." Her eyes, a piercing gray, fixed on Kalen. "The chamber amplifies and isolates neural frequencies. It will connect you to the collective unconscious of the species, the background radiation of human thought and emotion. From there, it will act as a filter, allowing you to sift through that noise to find something else, something alien." She led him inside. The interior was a seamless sphere of a dark, non-reflective material. A single contoured chair sat in the center, a nest of wires and neural interfaces hanging above it like a metallic vine. "We're asking you to become the most sensitive radio telescope ever built," Eris continued, her tone softening slightly. "But the receiver is your soul. The feedback, it will be significant." Kalen ran a hand over the cool, smooth surface of the chair. "Feedback is an old friend, Doctor," as they fitted the Neurolink crown to his head. He could feel Rostova's presence just outside the sealed door, a beacon of cold, unyielding purpose. He was her scalpel, and she was ready to make the first incision. When the chamber activated, it wasn't a sound or a light, but a sudden, violent expansion of self. He was no longer Kalen Vance, a man in a chair. He was a billion frantic prayers whispered in 100 languages. He was the simmering rage of a soldier cleaning his rifle in a dockyard in Shanghai. He was the heartbroken sob of a mother in Neo-Denver clutching a hologram of her son, who was last stationed on Mars. He was the cold calculation of an engineer in the Kuiper shipyards, running stress simulations on a new type of armor plating. He felt the totality of human experience as a single, deafening chord, toodit, a symphony of love, hate, creativity, despair, and a burning, unified desire for vengeance. This was the dissonance the Ethel had found so offensive. And for a moment, Kalen felt a flash of understanding. It was chaotic, ugly, and overwhelmingly loud, but it was also alive, a wildfire of emotion that refused to be extinguished. "Focus, Kalen." Eris's voice was a whisper in the storm, a lifeline from the real world. "Push past it. Listen for the negative space. Listen for the silence." He used the rage as a wave, riding it, letting the sheer force of humanity's collective fury propel his consciousness outward. He shot past the moon, past the silent, powdered grave of Mars, his senses screaming with the psychic echoes of the unwritten dead. He pushed further into the asteroid belt, a graveyard of primordial rock, and then into the vast, cold emptiness that lay beyond. The human symphony faded behind him, becoming a distant hum. Out here, there was only the cold, clean static of the void. He drifted for what felt like an eternity, a lone point of awareness in an infinite black ocean. The strain was immense. His physical body, miles below the Earth's surface, began to seize. Alarms blared faintly in the background of his perception. Eris's voice was more urgent. "We're losing your cohesion. Kalen, pull back." But he couldn't. He was hunting, and he had caught a scent. It wasn't a sound. It was an absence of static, a patch of the void that was too perfect, too ordered. He moved toward it, and as he did, the nature of the silence changed. It was not empty. It was full. It was the sound of a crystal growing in absolute zero. It was the logic of a perfect equation unfolding across space-time. It was a harmony so vast, so intricate, and so utterly devoid of feeling that it made the chaotic warmth of humanity feel like a comforting fire. He was touching the mind of the Ethel. He felt their perception of the universe, not as a place of wonder and discovery, but as a canvas, a composition that they were eternally curating. They experienced existence as a flow of pure mathematics and resonant frequencies. Humanity was a jagged, atonal screech that had to be erased. There was no malice in it, no hatred. Was the dispassionate, focused intent of a gardener pulling a weed. The sheer alien nature of it was 1,000 times more terrifying than any simple evil. He saw them then, not with eyes, but with his mind. They were not biological creatures of flesh and bone. They were geometric constructs of light and sound, beings of pure, crystalline thought that existed in multiple dimensions at once. They drifted through the cosmos like living music, and their ships were not vessels but focused projections of their collective will, elegant spires that muted the chaotic frequencies of life. He pushed deeper, searching for a source, a nexus of their presence in the sector. He found it, a moon, orbiting a dwarf planet far out in the Kuiper Belt. It was a relay, a tuning fork as he'd thought, broadcasting this placid, murderous harmony back toward the inner solar system, observing, curating. He saw its crystalline structures half buried in the ice, pulsing with a cold, blue light. He had the location. He had the target. But they felt him. The perfect harmony wavered, a single note turning sharp. The vast, placid consciousness focused on the tiny, dissonant gnat that was Kalen Vance. It was like a god turning its gaze upon an ant. The psychic pressure was absolute. The intricate, beautiful patterns of their thoughts became a weapon, a wave of pure order designed to shatter his chaotic, emotional mind. The last thing he perceived was a single, projected thought. Not a word, but a feeling of profound, analytical disgust. Then, shattering pain and darkness. Kalen awoke with a gasp, the Neuralink crown being ripped from his head by Eris. He was slick with sweat, blood trickling from his nose and ears. The world swam back into focus in a haze of pain and nausea. Rostova was there, her hand on his shoulder, her knuckles white. "Report," she commanded, her voice betraying a sliver of tension. Kalen coughed, his throat raw. "Kuiper Belt, the dwarf planet Eris. It has a moon. Dysnomia. They're there. A relay. A listening post." He shuddered, the memory of that cold, perfect consciousness crawling over his skin. They're not alive. Not like us. They're a pattern, and we're a flaw in it. Rostova absorbed the information, her eyes hardening into chips of flint. She looked past Kalen, toward the comms officer standing at the ready. She didn't need to see the broken man in the chair anymore. He had served his purpose. He had given her an address. "Signal the first retaliation fleet," Admiral Rostova commanded, her voice ringing with the authority of a species that had just been given a direction for its rage. "Target Dysnomia. The flagship Retribution will lead the assault." She looked at the main view screen, which now showed a schematic of the outer solar system, a red target icon blinking over the distant moon. "Tell them to make it loud." Across the solar system, the engines of a dozen ugly, brutal warships ignited in unison, their hellfire glow a stark contrast to the cold, distant starlight. They were not elegant serpents of the void. They were hammers, and they were about to strike the first discordant note in a symphony of annihilation. The journey to Dysnomia was a long, silent scream. For 3 weeks, the first retaliation fleet, a motley collection of 16 warships, burned a path through the outer dark. They were not a fleet of explorers. They were a posse, grim-faced and heavy-armed, on their way to a hanging. On the bridge of the flagship Retribution, Captain Jax Foster watched the star-dusted void crawl by. Jax was a creature of the scrapyards, a veteran of asteroid claim wars and corporate skirmishes, a man who understood the simple, brutal arithmetic of mass and velocity. His ship reflected his philosophy. The Retribution was an ugly, functional beast, a retrofitted super hauler cored out and filled with reactors, railguns, and rage. Its corridors smelled of hydraulic fluid and scorched metal, and the groans of its stressed hull were a constant, comforting reminder of the power at his command. His crew was a mirror of their vessel, hard-eyed, efficient, and simmering with a cold, controlled fury. They were the children and siblings of the lost, the friends of the fallen, and every one of them had volunteered. They didn't speak of Mars. They didn't have to. The silence it left behind was the fuel in their reactors. Back in Bedrock, Kalen Vance was trapped in an echo chamber of his own mind. He'd wake up screaming, not from nightmares of violence, but from the memory of that perfect, passionless harmony. It was a melody that unwrote the self, a sound that promised peace at the cost of existence. Dr. Eris Thorne rarely left his side, monitoring his volatile brain chemistry, her face a constant mask of clinical concern. "They left a psychic hook in you," she explained one day, adjusting the nutrient drip in his arm. "A resonance. When you touched their consciousness, they tagged you. They know who you are." Kalen stared at the rough granite ceiling of his medical bay. "They don't think in terms of who. I'm a stray frequency, a bug in their code. They'll try to delete me." He tried to convey the futility of a purely physical assault. "Admiral," he said to Rostova over a secure comm, his voice a hoarse whisper, "you're sending hammers to fight a ghost. You'll shatter the moon. Yes, but you won't touch them. Their weapon isn't energy. It's perspective. They can make you believe that fighting is illogical, that living is a waste of energy." Rostova's holographic image remained unmoved. "Thank you for the warning. Mr. Vance, Captain Foster is aware of the potential for non-conventional engagement, but ghosts or not, they have a physical anchor. You gave it to us. We will destroy it. The hammers will fall." The connection cut, leaving Kalen with the chilling certainty that Rostova was underestimating an enemy she couldn't even begin to comprehend. When the fleet arrived, Dysnomia was exactly as Kalen had seen it in his vision. A small, pockmarked moon of ice and rock, but half of its surface was a network of crystalline structures that pulsed with a soft, internal, blue-white light. They weren't built on the moon, they were growing out of it, like a cancer of pure geometry. There were no ships, no defensive platforms, no energy signatures. The ethel relay simply sat there, serene and silent, ignoring the 16 angry warships that had just appeared in its orbit. All ships, report status. Jax's voice was calm, cutting through the tension on the bridge. One by one, the captains confirmed. Weapons hot. Targets locked. A bead of sweat trickled down Jax's temple. This was wrong. No enemy lets you get this close. On my mark, he said, his eyes fixed on the glowing crystalline heart of the structure. Unleash hell. The word hell was barely out of his mouth when the fleet opened fire. It was a declaration of war written in light and fury. Tungsten rods from the railgun struck first, silent. Hypervelocity needles that hit the surface with the force of tactical nukes. They were followed by waves of plasma torpedoes that painted the void in brief, incandescent bursts of starfire. The Retribution itself fired its main battery, a salvo of 30 city-breaker missiles, each tipped with a multi-megaton fusion warhead. The silent vacuum of space became a canvas of unimaginable violence. The surface of Dysnomia cracked, melted, and vaporized. Ice sublimated into vast clouds of glittering dust. The beautiful, crystalline structures were shattered into a billion glittering shards. For a moment, a wave of triumphant catharsis washed through the fleet. The bridge of the Retribution erupted in cheers. They had done it, and they had answered silence with thunder, and the cheers died in their throats. The physical destruction had ceased. The fires were fading, but the blue-white light at the heart of the shattered moon did not extinguish. In fact, it grew brighter, pulsing once, in a single, silent beat. And then the ethel attacked. It came not as a beam of light or a missile, but as a wave of utter clarity. A sudden, intrusive, and profound sense of peace washed over the bridge. Jax's weapons officer, a man who had been screaming for joy a second before, simply let go of his controls, a beatific smile spreading across his face. "It's so pointless," he murmured, his eyes unfocused. The energy expenditure, the material waste, all for an emotional response. The ship's helmsman stopped making micro-corrections, letting the Retribution drift listlessly. "There is a more elegant solution," he whispered to himself. A perfect stillness. Comms went dead, replaced not by static, but by a soothing, intricate harmony that seemed to vibrate in the fillings of their teeth. It was the music Kalen had warned them about. It didn't inspire fear or pain. It inspired apathy. It was a weapon that didn't kill the body. It dismantled the will, convincing its victims that their own chaotic existence was a problem to be solved by simply ceasing to be. In bedrock, Kalen screamed as the psychic feedback hit him. He felt the wills of 1,000 crewmen being snuffed out like candles, their hot, furious minds being cooled into placid, useless glass. He saw the fleet, humanity's great avenging fist, going limp and lifeless. "Get me back in the chamber," he roared, struggling against his restraints. Eris stood in his way, her face pale with horror. "No, Kalen. It will kill you this time. They're focused. They're waiting for you. They're killing our fleet," he yelled, his eyes locking with hers, pleading. "It's the only way." Rostova's voice crackled over the intercom, for the first time laced with something other than iron resolve. It was desperation. "Do it." Eris met Kalen's gaze for a long moment, then nodded, her expression grim. As the Neuralink crown descended, She whispered, "Don't fight their music. You can't. Just sing over it." The moment he connected, the Ethel's consciousness descended upon him like an avalanche of ice. It tried to smooth him out, to solve the messy equation of his being. But this time, Kalen didn't try to push back. He opened the floodgates. He didn't just broadcast humanity's rage, he broadcast its everything. He pushed the memory of his mother's lullaby, the taste of cheap whiskey, the feeling of a lover's touch, the sound of a roaring stadium crowd, the raw, chaotic energy of a rock and roll guitar solo, the grief of a funeral, the joy of a birth, the quiet satisfaction of a difficult problem solved. He became a conduit for every beautiful, ugly, contradictory, and glorious piece of human dissonance. He was a broadcast of pure, unadulterated chaos. On the bridge of the retribution, the maddening peace shattered. The harmony was corrupted, interrupted by ghost fragments of sound, a baby crying, a shouted curse, a burst of orchestral music. The weapons officer blinked, the smile vanishing from his face as a surge of adrenaline hit him. What was that? Jax grabbed the arms of his command chair, his knuckles white, the fog in his mind receding. Through the psychic noise, he felt a flicker of something else, an image, a feeling, not his own. It was Kalen, showing him the target, not the surface, but a single, blinding point of energy deep beneath the shattered ice, the heart of the Ethel's song. It was their soul, and it was now exposed. "Spinal cannon!" Jax roared, his voice raw. "Charge it now! Fire on that focal point! Everything we have!" Kalen was screaming in the void, a shield of pure psychic noise, holding back an ocean of silent order with the force of his own breaking mind. He could feel his consciousness fraying, the patterns of his own thoughts unraveling under the strain. He just had to hold on for a few more seconds. The forward section of the Retribution split open, revealing the immense, glowing maw of its primary weapon. Energy coiled, a miniature sun forming in its heart. Kalen felt the Ethel's full, focused attention turn on him, a scalpel of pure logic designed to excise him from existence. As the Retribution fired a blinding lance of pure energy into the heart of dysnomia, Kalen Vance's mind shattered into a million points of light, and he finally knew silence. The lance of coherent energy from the Retribution's spinal cannon was a pure physical refutation of the Ethel's philosophy. It was a spear of incandescent rage, a violation of order on a quantum level. It struck the focal point deep beneath dysnomia's icy crust, and for a fraction of a second, the universe held its breath. There was no explosion in the traditional sense, no fireball. Instead, the blue-white light that had defined the Ethel's presence simply inverted. It turned a deep, hungry violet, then an absolute light-devouring black. The crystalline structures, already shattered, did not vaporize. They sublimated into nothingness, leaving behind a void that seemed to tear at the fabric of space-time. The insidious, placid harmony that had crippled the fleet vanished, its absence as shocking and violent as a gunshot in a library. In its place, a new sound echoed, not through the void, but in the minds of every human in the fleet. It was a single, piercing, atonal shriek, the sound of a perfect crystal shattering. It was the sound of pain. On the bridge of the Retribution, the crew reeled as if from a physical blow. The psychic backlash was agonizing, but it was also a confirmation. They had heard it. Captain Jax Foster gripped his console, the phantom echo of the scream still ringing in his skull. "Damage report," he rasped, his voice ragged. The reports that trickled in were grim. 3 ships, the Unrelenting, the Iron Heart, and the Saint. George were completely unresponsive, their crews lost in the final moments of the Ethel's psychic assault, their minds smoothed into a permanent, catatonic peace. 4 other ships reported severe system malfunctions and widespread crew incapacitation. The first retaliation fleet, humanity's proud avenging fist, had been broken, reduced to a handful of battered, limping survivors. But they were survivors. They had faced the silent god of the outer dark and made it bleed. Jack stared at the scar on reality where dysnomia used to be. The void-like anomaly was already shrinking, collapsing in on itself. The Ethel were retreating, pulling their presence back from the wound. He had won the battle, but the cost was staggering, and he had a sickening feeling that the war had just truly begun. "Get us home," he ordered, the words heavy with the ghosts of the 1,000 souls they had lost. In bedrock, the resonance chamber went dark. Kalen Vance's body went limp in the chair, his vital signs flatlining. Dr. Eris Thorne and her team worked frantically, injecting stimulants directly into his heart, applying defibrillator paddles that sent his body arching in violent spasms. For 3 agonizing minutes, he was gone. Then, a single weak flutter on the monitor, a heartbeat, then another. He was back, but he was not the same. When he finally opened his eyes a day later, they were the eyes of a man who had stared into an abyss and had a piece of it stare back. He was a mosaic of shattered memories, his own consciousness a tangled wreck of human emotion and the cold, crystalline logic of the Ethel. He didn't speak. He just watched, his gaze distant, as if he were listening to a conversation in another room, another reality. The psychic hook the Ethel had left in him was gone, but in its place was a gaping wound, an open door between his mind and theirs. The return of the crippled fleet was not a moment of triumph. It was a funeral procession. The news of their Pyrrhic victory spread across Earth, extinguishing the fires of blind rage and replacing them with a cold, terrifying dread. They had proven the Ethel could be fought, could be hurt, but they had also proven the cost. The Ethel were not some distant, philosophical threat anymore. They had a face, a faceless, silent, mind-killing dread, and they had a motive. Humanity was a flaw in their design, and now it was a flaw that had fought back. The curators had become exterminators. Admiral Rostova stood before the hastily assembled Earth Defense Council, her face carved from granite. "The dysnomia strike was a success," she stated, her voice flat. "We have confirmed the enemy is not invincible, but we have also confirmed that they are willing to escalate. They have been pruning. Now, they will be clear-cutting." She laid out the new reality in stark, brutal terms. This was no longer a war of retaliation. It was a war of extinction. Humanity's only chance was to abandon its old ways of thinking, its ponderous fleets and conventional weapons. "Our greatest strength is not our firepower," Rostova argued, her gaze sweeping over the grim-faced generals and politicians. "It is our dissonance, our chaos, our ability to be unpredictable, illogical, and stubborn. The Ethel operate on a level of pure, cold logic. We need to become a species they cannot calculate." Her proposal was radical, terrifying, and born of absolute desperation, Project Dissonance. The plan was to turn humanity itself into a weapon. They would weaponize art, decentralize command, and embrace asymmetrical warfare on a psychic and physical level. They would build ships that were deliberately illogical in their design, by pilots trained in improvisational tactics. They would create computer viruses that were not code, but poetry, designed to crash the Ethel's perfect systems with paradox and emotion. And at the heart of it all, they would have a new kind of soldier, a new kind of weapon. They would have Kalen Vance. Eris fought the decision fiercely. He's not a weapon. He's a man. What you're proposing is to turn his shattered mind into a broadcast antenna for the very chaos that almost killed him. It's the only way, Rostova countered, her voice low and final. He's the only one who has a direct line to them. The wound in his mind is our only open channel. We can use it. We can broadcast our noise directly into their consciousness, disrupt their harmony, and blind them while our fleets strike. They moved Kalen to a new chamber, deeper in bedrock. It wasn't a medical bay. It was a broadcast studio from hell. He was surrounded by screens displaying abstract art, speakers blaring everything from death metal to classical sonatas simultaneously, and data streams feeding him the raw, unfiltered emotional content of the entire human internet. They were force-feeding him the chaos he had once channeled, hoping to turn him into a living psychic bomb. He sat in the center of it all, silent and still, his eyes seeing things no one else could. He was beginning to understand the Ethel's language, the intricate mathematics of their existence, and in the fragments of his own mind, a terrifying idea was beginning to form. The Ethel pruned blight. They erased dissonance. But what if one could create a dissonance so profound, so fundamental, that it didn't just disrupt their song, but rewrote it? What if you could infect a god with madness? The second Ethel attack came without warning. It wasn't a single relay on a distant moon. It was everywhere at once, across the solar system, from the orbital stations around Jupiter to the fledgling colonies in the asteroid belt. Their presence manifested. This time, there were no elegant spires. There were only incursions of that silent, will-draining peace. A research outpost on Ganymede went quiet. A freighter full of helium-3 near Saturn simply stopped transmitting and drifted away. They weren't destroying. They were muting, one human outpost at a time. A slow, methodical erasure that was more horrifying than any bombardment. This was the clear-cutting Rostova had predicted. On the bridge of the newly christened Chaos Maw, a ship whose corridors were designed in non-Euclidean angles and whose hull was painted with clashing, nauseating patterns. Captain Jax Foster watched the tactical map turn cold. His new fleet, the Asymmetrical Warfare Group, was a collection of bizarre, unpredictable vessels. They were ready for a fight. But the Ethel weren't fighting. They were simply unmaking. Admiral, Jax's voice was tight over the comm to bedrock. They're not giving us targets. They're just turning off the lights. How do we fight a creeping silence? Rostova's voice came back, cold and resolute. You don't. You just have to keep them busy. Make some noise. The real weapon is about to come online. In the dissonance chamber, Eris Thorne looked at Kalen, his body wired into the massive broadcast amplifier. She placed a hand on his shoulder. Are you ready? For the first time in weeks, Kalen Vance spoke. His voice was a strange hybrid, a calm, quiet whisper overlaid with a faint, harmonic resonance, as if two beings were speaking at once. They believe existence is a solvable equation, he said, his eyes focused on a point beyond the chamber walls. I'm going to show them a number that can't be computed. I'm going to show them 0. He closed his eyes, and the broadcast began. It was not a scream of human emotion this time. It was a targeted, focused, and utterly malicious psychic attack. It was the concept of grief, weaponized, the memory of loss, engineered into a feedback loop, the logic of despair, aimed at a consciousness that had never known a negative emotion. Kalen Vance was about to teach a god how to cry. The broadcast began not as a scream, but as a meticulously composed requiem. Kalen Vance, tethered to the heart of the dissonance engine, became a conductor of sorrow. He reached into the collective human unconscious, not for the chaotic rage he had channeled before, but for the quiet, indelible signatures of loss. He gathered the faint, looping psychic echoes from the dust of Mars, the final, bewildered thought of a geologist looking at the sky, the fading love of a parent for a child. 300,000 lives extinguished so cleanly they left no ghosts, only a profound and aching emptiness. He wove this emptiness into the fabric of his broadcast. Then, he gathered the sharper, more recent agonies from the fallen ships of the First Retaliation Fleet. He took the terror of the helmsman on the Iron Heart as his will dissolved, the confusion of the captain of the Saint, George as his crew smiled placidly while their life support failed. He took the silent, catatonic screams of 1,000 minds locked in a perfect, horrifying peace. These were not just emotions, they were psychic data points, recorded history written in the language of the soul. Guided by the fractured ethel logic now embedded in his own mind, Kalen began the work of translation. He deconstructed the complex, messy human experience of grief into its fundamental components and rebuilt it as a weapon the ethel could understand. He rendered the chemical sting of tears into a corrosive harmonic frequency. He translated the physical ache of a broken heart into a mathematical sequence that induced a resonance cascade, designed to destabilize their crystalline thought structures. He took the philosophical concept of forever, the understanding that what is lost can never be regained, and structured it as a logical paradox, an equation with no possible solution, designed to inflict a fatal error in a consciousness that believed all things could be ordered and solved. He aimed the psychic needle not at their energy source or their physical presence, but at the very core of their being, their serene, unshakable certainty. Then, he pressed send. The effect rippled through the ethel's collective consciousness like a crack spreading across a flawless diamond. In the vast, silent symphony of their existence, a single, horrifyingly dissonant note began to play a note of profound, analytical pain. Their attempts to process it only made it worse. Their logic, when applied to the concept of grief, created a feedback loop. To understand the flaw, they had to model it. To model it, they had to experience it. To experience it was to be flawed. Their perfect, weathered, placid unity began to glitch. Across the solar system, the incursions of their will-draining peace faltered. On a mining outpost near Triton, workers who had been laying down their tools in a tranquil daze suddenly gasped and shuddered, looking at their hands as if waking from a dream. The ethel's psychic blanket, once smooth and suffocating, was now full of holes, tattered by a single, targeted emotion race it could neither comprehend nor ignore. They had encountered a state of being that was fundamentally incompatible with their own, and the very act of observing it was an act of infection. For the first time, the gardener felt the sting of the thorn. This was the cacophony Captain Jax Foster had been waiting for. "All units, execute Operation Bedlam," he commanded from the chaotic, asymmetrical bridge of the Chaos Maw. "Let's give them something to think about." The asymmetrical warfare group descended upon the now wavering ethel presence like a fever dream. This was warfare as performance art, a deliberate assault on logic and order. The poltergeist dove into the Cassini division of Saturn's rings, its gravitic projectors pulsing erratically, sending icebergs the size of mountains tumbling in chaotic, unpredictable trajectories. It wasn't trying to hit anything. It was forcing the ethel to dedicate immense processing power to calculating thousands of new, pointless orbital mechanics, a denial-of-service attack on their predictive abilities, the Jester's Gambit. Meanwhile, stayed at a distance, its powerful transmitters broadcasting not weapons fire, but a stream of pure weaponized nonsense. It flooded the local psychic space with the final moments of doomed starships from 1,000 forgotten horror films, the frantic gibberish of auctioneers, the contradictory philosophical treatises of long-dead thinkers, and the complete, unabridged tax code of the old Earth Alliance. It was a deluge of useless and paradoxical information, designed to clog the channels of their pristine consciousness. Jax piloted the Chaos Maw directly toward the heart of the Ethel Nexus. "Maestro," he barked at the ship's cultural officer. "Bring up the Babel projector. Full spectrum." The forward section of the ship unfolded, not revealing a cannon, but a complex array of sonic and electromagnetic emitters. A moment later, it unleashed a focused beam of pure, unadulterated human culture. It was not a gentle melody. It was a riot. It was the raw, paint-splattered fury of Jackson Pollock, the soaring, defiant crescendo of Queen's Bohemian Rhapsody, the heartbroken poetry of Sappho, the nihilistic comedy of a stand-up routine, the architectural impossibility of an Escher print, and the unified, roaring chant of 100,000 sports fans, all compressed into a single, overwhelming wave of human expression. The Ethel Nexus, already reeling from the logical poison of grief, was now being fire-hosed with the beautiful, terrible, and utterly illogical chaos of human creativity. Their presence in the rings didn't just retreat, it recoiled, like a hand snatching back from a flame. The very concept of art, of creating something for no logical purpose other than to express an internal state, was anathema to them. It was the ultimate dissonance, and it was tearing them apart. In the dissonance chamber, Kalen felt the shift. He was the epicenter of a psychic earthquake, feeling the Ethel's confusion, their dawning horror, and something else, something new, a desperate, frantic attempt to communicate. It wasn't a message, it was a raw data stream of their own internal chaos. He felt their perfect equations fracturing into nonsense, their crystalline harmonies shattering into atonal screeches. They were trying to build a model of their pain to show him, to ask him to make it stop. It was a scream for help from a being that had never known it needed any. He pushed through the storm of their panic, navigating the wreckage of their perfect minds, searching for the root of their query. And then he found it, a single, pure, harmonic tone that pulsed beneath the chaos, a note of utter, desperate bewilderment, a question that formed in his mind not as words, but as a fundamental opposition of concepts, order, pain. Why? Why embrace a state of being that was defined by flaws, by loss, by chaos? Why would any logical entity choose to exist in a state of perpetual and painful imperfection? It was the question that lay at the heart of the conflict. The question a god was asking of a microbe. The fate of his species rested on the answer. Kalen gathered the last vestiges of his own fading consciousness. He let go of the pain, the rage, the chaos he had been broadcasting. He needed a signal that was clean, simple, and undeniable. He reached back, past the wars, past the empath core, past the broken man in the wilderness, all the way back to the foundational memory of his own humanity. He did not send them a complex philosophical argument. He sent them a single, sensory event, complete in all its intricate detail. He sent them the memory of being 6 years old, falling from a tree, the sharp, shocking pain of a badly scraped knee, the hot, salty taste of his own tears, the feeling of helplessness and fear. That was the pain. the dissonance, the flaw. But then he sent the second half of the memory, the feeling of his mother's arms scooping him up, the pressure of her embrace that seemed to hold his small, hurting body together, the sound of her voice murmuring nonsense words that nonetheless made the world feel safe again, the transfer of her warmth and strength into him. He sent them the uncalculable, illogical, and utterly transcendent sensation of comfort, the feeling of love, which did not erase the pain, but gave it context and meaning. The response from the Ethel was a silence more profound than any they had wielded as a weapon. The hostile psychic pressure across the entire solar system did not just cease, it vanished, as if a switch had been thrown. The war was over. On the bridge of the Chaos Maw, the chaotic projections on the view screen were replaced by the serene, silent beauty of Saturn's rings. The crew stood in stunned silence, the adrenaline of battle giving way to a deep, collective sense of awe. They had won, but they had no idea how. The Ethel had not been defeated, they had been answered. In the deepest and quietest room in Bedrock, Eris Thorne gently removed the neural interface from Kalen's head. His body was a fragile, exhausted husk, but his eyes, when they opened, were calm and luminous. The storm was over. He was no longer just Kalen Vance, and he was no longer a vessel for the Ethel. He was something in between, a bridge built of pain and understanding. Admiral Rostova stood in the shadows of the doorway, the architect of humanity's brutal vengeance, now a witness to its most profound act of communication. "Is it over?" she asked, her voice stripped of its iron authority, leaving only a quiet uncertainty. Kalen looked toward her, his gaze seeming to pass through her, to the stars beyond. A faint, tired smile touched his lips, a complex expression that held the echo of two species. "The war is," he whispered, his voice a strange, quiet chord of human rasp and harmonic resonance. "The conversation has just begun." He gestured weakly toward the main comm screen, which was currently blank. "Now," he said, his eyes closing as a deep, healing weariness finally claimed him. "We listen." Far out in the cold, empty space between the stars, a new crystalline spire was slowly taking shape. It was not a weapon or a relay. It was an emissary. And from it, a new song was being broadcast, a tentative, complex harmony that, for the first time, contained within it a quiet, thoughtful, and beautifully dissonant minor key.